poor girls hand a Christmas card to the billionaire, and one of them says, "Our grandma said we should give it to you someday." He opens the card and starts crying when he reads the last sentence. Snowflakes were falling outside the window, but Richard Donovan didn't notice them. His eyes were fixed on his laptop screen and his fingers typed away without a pause. It was 10 o'clock at night on December 24th, and the only sound in the mansion was the keyboard echoing through the empty corridors. The stone house, with its dozens of rooms, seemed even larger in the winter, while the other residences in the upscale neighborhood glowed with Christmas lights. Richard's property remained dark, except for the faint glow coming from his office. "Another year," he muttered to himself. A familiar feeling of emptiness settled in his chest, but he was already used to it. Richard stood up and poured himself a finger of whiskey. At 55 years old, he had amassed more money than he could spend in multiple lifetimes. Forbes magazine had listed him among the richest men in the world for almost a decade. His technology and investment companies generated millions every day. What he did not have was someone to share Christmas Eve with. His phone vibrated with a message from his assistant. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Donovan. Reminder, meeting with Japanese investors on December 26th, VT 8 a.m. Richard replied with a short, "Thank you, Janet." "Merry Christmas." Routine phrases he repeated every year. There were no gift exchanges, no invitations. Everyone knew the boss did not engage in unnecessary sentimentality. He returned to his desk and got back to work. He was reviewing details of a billion-dollar acquisition when the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence of the house. Richard frowned. Who would come to his door on a night like this? He ignored it. Probably some lost caroler or unwanted neighbors. The bell rang again, more insistently. Annoyed by the interruption, Richard finally got up and walked through the dark corridors. Upon opening the door, a blast of cold wind blew in some snow. Richard had to look down to find the source of the disturbance. Two small children stood on his doorstep. The older one clung tightly to the younger one's hand, both with red noses from the cold and worn-out coats. "What do you want?" he asked, not hiding his irritation. The older girl, with dark hair in messy braids, took a step forward. "Are you Mr. Richard?" "Richard Donovan," she asked in a thin yet determined voice. Richard was surprised. Unknown children knowing his name was not common. "That's me." "Who are you?" "I'm Sophie." She pointed to herself and then at the smaller girl by her side. "And this is my sister Ellie. Our grandma said we should give this to you." Sophie stretched out her hand, holding a red envelope slightly creased at the edges. Richard hesitated before taking it. "Your grandma? Who is your grandma, girl?" Little Ellie, with lighter hair, hid behind her sister, but her curious eyes stayed on Richard. "Our Grandma Margaret," Sophie replied simply. "She said that one day we would give this to you, and today she said it was the day." The name hit Richard like a bucket of cold water. Margaret, a name he hadn't heard in over 20 years, a name he had tried hard to bury in the depths of his memory. His hands trembled slightly as he held the envelope. "Margaret?" he repeated, almost in a whisper. "Margaret who?" "What's her last name?" "Margaret Taylor, but she used to be Margaret Wilson," Sophie explained. "Grandma said you would recognize her name." The last name felt like a punch to the gut. Margaret Wilson, now Taylor. The two girls looked at him expectantly, and Richard noticed they were shivering in the cold. The snow was falling harder. "Come in," he said abruptly, opening the door wider. "It's snowing too heavily for you to stay out there." Sophie hesitated, looking at her younger sister. "Grandma said to just give you the envelope and come back home." "And where's your home?" Richard asked, noting their simple clothes and already soaked shoes. "At the end of Rose Garden Street, past the bakery," Sophie answered. Richard knew the area, a modest neighborhood a few miles away. The idea of two small children walking that distance alone in the middle of a snowstorm was unthinkable. "It's too far, and the snow is too heavy. Come in for a bit, at least until it lets up," he insisted, keeping his tone controlled. They exchanged glances, and after Sophie gave a small nod, they cautiously stepped inside. Their eyes widened at the sight of the mansion's interior. "Wow," whispered Ellie, her tiny voice echoing in the hall. "It's a castle." Richard closed the door and led the girls to the living room. He turned on the lights and switched on the electric fireplace, which immediately began to emit heat. "Sit down," he said, indicating the leather sofa. The girls climbed on together, their little legs dangling without reaching the floor. Their curious eyes roamed every corner of the room, lingering on the bookshelves and art pieces. Richard remained standing, holding the red envelope. Now that the girls were inside his home, he felt strangely out of place, like an intruder in his own space. "Do you want something to drink? Hot chocolate, maybe?" he offered, unsure how to behave around children. Both pairs of eyes lit up at the mention of hot chocolate, and they nodded eagerly. Richard gave a small nod back and headed to the kitchen, an immense, immaculate space with state-of-the-art appliances that were rarely used. While heating the milk, Richard finally took a deep breath and opened the envelope. Inside was a simple card, decorated with silver snowflake drawings. When he opened it, his heart raced as he immediately recognized the handwriting. Those carefully drawn letters, slightly slanted to the right. "You deserve love even if you've forgotten how to receive it." Just one sentence. No signature, no explanation. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 2 decades of choices and sacrifices. The milk started bubbling, snapping him back to the present. Mechanically, he prepared 2 mugs of hot chocolate, found some cookies in a cabinet, and placed everything on a tray. When he returned to the living room, he saw the girls still gazing around in wonder. "Here," he said, placing the tray on the coffee table. "Careful, it's hot." Sophie thanked him politely while Ellie was already reaching for the cookies. Richard watched them for a moment, noticing details. The way Sophie carefully blew on her hot chocolate, the way Ellie chewed, leaving crumbs on her lap. There was something about them that seemed familiar, maybe the eyes or the shape of their faces. "Do you live with your Grandma Margaret?" he asked, taking a seat on an armchair a short distance away. Sophie nodded, swallowing a sip of her drink. "Yes, ever since Mommy went to heaven." The simplicity of her reply caught Richard off guard. "I'm sorry," he said automatically. "And your dad?" "He left," Sophie replied. "Grandma says he wasn't ready to be a dad. Now it's just the 3 of us." Richard absorbed this, feeling a twinge of something he couldn't identify. He looked again at the card in his hands, reading that single sentence once more. "And how is she, your grandma?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Sophie shrugged. "She's okay. She works a lot at the flower shop. Sometimes she gets tired. Today she's baking a cake for Christmas, but we don't have a tree because it's too expensive." The simplicity of their lives contrasted painfully with the empty luxury around him. Richard glanced at his pristine living room, noticing for the first time how absurd it was. A huge mansion for one man, while 3 people were cramped somewhere much too small. "Did you come here on your own?" he asked. "No," Sophie replied. "Mr. Jenkins, our neighbor, drove us to the corner. He's Grandma's friend and said he'd wait for us, but the snow got too heavy and he had to leave." She paused. "Grandma doesn't know he left. We thought we could make it back on our own." A sudden concern gripped Richard. "Does your grandma know you're here now?" They exchanged guilty looks. Sophie bit her lower lip. "Not exactly. She only asked Mr. Jenkins to drop us off at the corner with the envelope. We decided to come to the door." Snow was falling heavily outside now. Richard could see it piling up quickly, covering the streets and making them nearly impassable. "Your grandma must be worried," he said, grabbing his cell phone. "Do you know her number?" Sophie shook her head. "But I know our address. It's 37 Rose Garden Street, apartment 2. Richard hesitated, phone still in hand. After so many years, was he about to speak with Margaret? "I'll take you home," he finally decided, standing. "This storm is getting worse." As he turned toward the window, he realized the situation was even worse than he'd thought. The snow already covered his entire front yard, and the wind was whipping it into small white whirlwinds. He picked up the remote and turned on the TV, tuning to a news channel. The reporter confirmed his fears. One of the worst snowstorms in recent years. Authorities advise everyone to stay home for the next 12 hours. Several roads are already closed and... Richard turned off the TV and looked back at the girls, who was staring at the snowfall with worried expressions. "It looks like you'll have to stay here tonight," he said slowly. The idea of having children sleep in his house felt utterly alien. "But Grandma will be worried," Sophie protested, her big eyes showing the first hint of fear since they arrived. "I'll try to call her," Richard promised. "Your last name is Taylor, right?" "Yes, Taylor." Sophie and Ellie Taylor. Richard took his phone and searched for Margaret Taylor, Rose Garden. After a few attempts, he found a phone number linked to a flower shop. He took a deep breath and dialed. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. Then, a woman's voice answered, a voice that, even after all these years, he would recognize anywhere. "Petals and Dreams Flower Shop. Margaret speaking." For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. Time seemed to freeze. "Hello, is anyone there?" The voice pressed. Richard cleared his throat. "Margaret, it's Richard Donovan." The silence on the other end was so profound he thought the call had dropped. Then her voice came back, quieter. "Richard, after all this time, how did you—" "Your granddaughters are at my house," he interrupted. "Sophie and Ellie. They came to give me your card, but now there's a snowstorm, and it's too dangerous to leave. They're safe. Don't worry." "Oh my God." Margaret's voice trembled. "I asked Jenkins to only drop them at the corner with the envelope. I never imagined. Are they okay?" "They're fine. Drinking hot chocolate." A sigh of relief from the other end. "Thank God, I was starting to panic. Jenkins called me saying he had to leave because of the snow, and I didn't know what to do." "They can stay here tonight," Richard found himself offering, surprising himself with his own words. "I have guest rooms and, well, it's safer than trying to leave in this weather." "Are you sure? I don't want to impose—" "It's no imposition," he replied automatically, though a few hours earlier, any interruption would have been precisely that. Can I talk to them?" "Of course." Richard handed the phone to Sophie. "It's your grandma?" Sophie spoke briefly, then passed the phone to Ellie, who just said yes and no while nodding. When she finished, she handed the phone back to Richard. "Margaret," he said, returning to the call. "Thank you for taking care of them, Richard. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Tomorrow's when the storm passes, I'll bring them home." "Okay," she paused. "About the card, we can talk about it tomorrow," he softly cut her off. He wasn't ready for that conversation, especially not on the phone. "All right," she agreed. "Take good care of my girls. You can trust me." When he hung up, he found two children staring at him with renewed curiosity. "Are you and Grandma friends?" Sophie asked, tilting her head. "We used to be," Richard answered, surprised by his honesty. "A long time ago." "A long time like when dinosaurs existed?" Ellie asked seriously. "Not that far," he said, "but before you two were born." "Why aren't you friends anymore?" Sophie persisted. "Sometimes people go their separate ways," he finally said. Sophie seemed to reflect on that. "Like Daddy did." The question caught him off guard. "Maybe, in a way." Silence settled among them, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Richard glanced at the two girls on his sofa with their empty mugs of hot chocolate. "You must be hungry," he realized, noting it was dinner time. "You don't know how to cook, do you?" asked Sophie. "Not really," Richard admitted. "Grandma says everyone should at least know how to make sandwiches and soup," Sophie declared confidently. "Well, I do know how to do that," Richard replied. "Would you like sandwiches?" Both nodded. Richard led them to the kitchen and began preparing simple sandwiches. Sophie and Ellie watched his every move with interest, sitting on high stools. "Do you live alone in this huge house?" Sophie asked. "Yes," Richard answered. "Just me. Don't you get sad?" "I would feel sad," she said. That simple question hit him harder than he expected. "Sometimes," he admitted, surprising even himself. They ate in silence and with the girls occasionally whispering to each other. Richard kept his distance, only responding when they asked him something directly. After dinner, Richard realized he needed to find a way to entertain them until bedtime. His house had nothing for children. "What do you usually do after dinner?" he asked. "Grandma reads stories to us," Sophie answered. "I think I have some paper and pencils in my office," Richard said, standing up. He returned with a few blank sheets and a box of colored pencils. Sophie and Ellie settled on the living room rug and started drawing without needing further suggestion. "I'm going to draw our house," Sophie announced, already focused on her task. "I'm going to draw Grandma," Ellie said, clutching a red pencil with her entire hand. Richard sat in a distant armchair, picking up his tablet to check some emails. Every now and then, he glanced over the screen at the two girls sprawled on his expensive rug. They whispered to each other quietly, completely immersed in their drawings. "Mr. Richard, look!" Sophie held up her drawing after a few minutes. It showed a simple house with smoke coming out of the chimney, 3 figures in front, presumably them and their grandmother, and a disproportionately large cat by their side. "Very nice," he replied without leaving his seat, giving it a quick glance before turning back to his emails. Ellie also showed her drawing, which was mostly colorful scribbles, but she seemed just as proud as her sister. Richard only nodded, uncomfortable with the attention the girls seemed to seek. For the next hour, he quietly observed the two of them drawing, making simple paper airplanes and inventing stories. It was strange to see his immaculate living room, usually used for formal meetings, occupied by 2 children scattered across his expensive rug. When Ellie yawned for the 3rd time, Richard checked the clock and realized it was past 9. "I think it's bedtime," he announced, standing up. He prepared one of the guest rooms, placing fresh towels and checking the blankets. He found 2 of his own oversized t-shirts to serve as improvised nightgowns. After helping them brush their teeth, Richard accompanied them to the bedroom. Sophie and Ellie climbed onto the king-size bed, looking tiny among the pillows. "Good night," Richard said, ready to leave. "Wait," Sophie called. "Grandma always tells us a bedtime story." Richard paused at the door. "I don't know any children's stories." "You can make one up," suggested Ellie, already snuggling in. After a moment's hesitation, Richard grabbed a book from the shelf, an autobiography of a famous entrepreneur. He read a few passages, adapting the words to sound more like a story. It wasn't exactly a children's tale, but his deep voice and the girls' tiredness were enough to lull them. When he noticed they were almost asleep, he stopped reading. He stood up to leave, but Sophie's sleepy voice stopped him. "Mr. Richard." "Yes?" "Thanks for the hot chocolate." Richard just nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, yet something stirred within him, like a door long sealed had been lightly tapped. "You're welcome, Sophie. Sleep well." As he left, he kept the door slightly ajar and a soft light on in the hallway. He returned to his office, where his laptop still displayed the work screen, everything exactly as he'd left it. But something had changed. Richard picked up the red card again, rereading. "You deserve love, even if you've forgotten how to receive it." Tomorrow he would have to return the girls home. He would have to see Margaret again after so many years. The idea, which should have caused anxiety, somehow felt inevitable now. As if these children had found a path through one of the barriers he'd built over the years, not entirely demolished, but with a small crack. Richard looked out the window, watching the snow continue to fall. The silence of his mansion, once a refuge, now felt almost oppressive. Richard woke up to the sound of childish laughter. For a moment, he was disoriented, not understanding where such an unusual noise in his always silent house could be coming from. Then, memories of the previous night came flooding back. The 2 girls, the card, Margaret. He got dressed, pulling a grey sweater over his shirt. Outside, he saw the storm had ended, leaving a bright white blanket over everything. The sky was clear, almost painfully blue against the snow. Following the sound of voices, Richard found Sophie and Ellie in the kitchen. Somehow, they had discovered where the cereal and milk were kept. Sitting on tall stools, they were having an improvised breakfast, legs swinging and chatting happily. "Good morning, Mr. Richard." Sophie noticed him first, waving a spoon and spilling drops of milk on the counter. "Good morning." He lingered in the doorway, still uncomfortable with their presence in his space. "I see you found breakfast. We woke up hungry," Sophie explained casually. "Grandma always lets us get our own cereal, so we just looked around." "Hope you don't mind," she added, suddenly worried at his neutral expression. "No, it's fine," he replied, heading to the coffee maker. Did you sleep well? Yes, Ellie said through a mouthful of cereal. The bed is really big, like a princess bed. Richard allowed himself a small smile as he brewed his coffee. The contrast between his usual solitary morning routine and this cheerful mess was striking. Bowls of cereal, spilled milk drops, wrinkled clothes from the day before. A kind of disorder that normally would annoy him but oddly did not. Your house is very pretty, Sophie commented, glancing around the high-end kitchen. But it's different from ours. What's your house like? Richard asked, sitting down with his coffee at a polite distance. Sophie perked up at the question. It's small but cozy. We have a blue sofa with pillows Grandma made. On the wall, we have lots of pictures of us and Mommy. And from the kitchen window, we can see the park. And there are flowers everywhere, Ellie added, because Grandma loves flowers. She makes arrangements to sell at the shop, Sophie continued. Sometimes she lets us help with daisies and sunflowers. She says we're her special helpers. Richard listened attentively, forming a mental image of the small apartment filled with flowers, family photos, and handmade items, everything his mansion was missing. Grandma works a lot, Sophie went on, stirring the last of her cereal. Morning at the shop, then sewing at home at night. She makes dresses and fixes clothes. She taught me how to do cross-stitch. I still can't do it, Ellie frowned. I'm too little. When you turn 5 like me, Grandma will teach you, Sophie reassured her. Then, turning to Richard, she said, Grandma said you were really smart when you were young. Richard almost choked on his coffee, caught off guard. She talks about me to you. Sometimes, Sophie shrugged. She has a picture of you hidden in her drawer. She thinks we don't know, but we've seen it. A picture? Richard asked, a lump forming in his throat. Yes, you look younger in it, with Grandma on a beach. Richard remembered immediately. Summer of 1991. They had driven to the coast in his old Chevy with radiator problems. Margaret wore a floral dress, and they were in their 20s, the whole future ahead of them. A stranger had offered to take their photo. It was the last summer before everything changed. We should call your Grandma, Richard said, changing the subject. She must be worried, even though she knows you stayed here. Sophie agreed. She always wakes up early. She's probably making bread. Bread? She bakes bread at home, Sophie explained, as if it were the most normal thing. Says it's tastier and cheaper. Richard picked up his phone and dialed the flower shop number he'd used the night before. Margaret answered on the second ring. Hello, Richard. Her voice was calmer than the previous night. Yes, good morning. The girls are fine. They just finished breakfast. How are the roads? They're clearing them now. I think in an hour or two, it'll be safe for you to bring them back. If it's not too much trouble, of course. No trouble at all, Richard replied. I'll bring them as soon as the roads are passable. A brief pause on the other end. Thank you, Richard, really. Something in her tone, a mix of gratitude and a hint of sadness, made Richard feel a pang in his chest. See you later, was all he could say before hanging up. While the girls finished breakfast, Richard checked local news. The main roads were being plowed, but it would take a few hours before everything was fully safe. He suggested the girls watch TV in the living room while they waited. Sophie asked to use the bathroom so they could tidy themselves up before leaving. Richard took them to one of the guest bathrooms and, uncertain, asked if they needed help. Sophie shook her head firmly. I'll take care of Ellie. Grandma taught me. He nodded, impressed by the sense of responsibility in a 5-year-old. Returning to his own room, Richard selected his clothes more carefully than usual, changing his shirt twice before settling on a simple navy blue one. Why was he nervous? It was just a quick trip, just taking the girls home. But it wasn't just any home. It was Margaret's home. While combing his hair, his eyes fell on the red card he'd left on the bedside table. You deserve love, even if you've forgotten how to receive it. The words seemed to pierce even deeper now, after a restless night's sleep, filled with dreams he couldn't fully recall, but that left a lingering nostalgia. 2 hours later, the roads were clear enough. Richard helped the girls into their coats and still damp shoes from the previous night's snow. They climbed into his Mercedes, and with them safely in the back seat, he headed toward Rose Garden Street. During the drive, Sophie acted as a guide, pointing out landmarks with enthusiasm. "That's our school, and that's the bakery where Grandma buys sweet buns on special Sundays. And over there's the park where we play when it's not too cold." Richard watched her excited face in the rearview mirror, Ellie nodding in agreement at each comment. The neighborhood was simple but well kept. Small houses and low-rise buildings, family-owned stores, a stark contrast to his street of high walls and mansions. "It's there. Right there." Sophie pointed to a modest brick building with potted plants at the entrance. "Even in winter. Apartment 2 on the ground floor." Richard parked in front of the building. His heart pounded as he helped the girls out of the car. Sophie ran ahead, pulling Ellie by the hand, eager to see their grandmother. Richard followed, the snow crunching under his expensive shoes. Sophie rang the doorbell several times in quick succession. He heard hurried footsteps from inside, and then the door opened. Margaret. 25 years had passed since they'd last seen each other, but Richard would recognize her anywhere. Her dark hair now threaded with silver, soft lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of time and smiles. She wore a simple sweater over a long skirt, her hands dusted with flour. She was still beautiful. "Grandma!" the girls yelled in unison, hugging her legs. Margaret crouched down to embrace them, but her green eyes, the same ones that had filled Richard's dreams for years, were fixed on him. "Richard," she said simply. "Margaret," he responded, the name coming out like a sigh. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, decades of distance and unspoken words hanging between them. Time seemed to fold over itself. He was 25 again, looking at the love of his life. She was 20, with the entire future in her eyes. "Grandma, Mr. Richard's house looks like a castle." Ellie broke the silence, tugging on Margaret's sweater. "And the bed is huge." Margaret blinked, returning to the present. She smiled at her granddaughters, then looked back at Richard. "Please, come in," she said, opening the door wider. "You must be freezing out there." Richard hesitated for an instant, but the fresh snowfall and Margaret's welcoming look convinced him. He went inside. The apartment was just as the girls had described, small but cozy. There were flowers in simple vases on the table and windowsills, even in winter. Photographs in mismatched frames covered an entire wall. Sophie and Ellie at different ages, a young woman who must have been their mother, and some faces Richard didn't recognize. The blue sofa with handmade pillows took up one corner, next to a shelf of books and children's toys. Everything exuded personality, life, and love, the exact opposite of his empty mansion. "Girls, take off those wet coats and change into something dry," Margaret instructed gently. "We have a special guest today." Sophie and Ellie dashed down a small hallway, presumably to their bedroom, leaving the adults alone in the living room. "Please, sit," Margaret indicated the sofa while wiping flour off her hands on her apron. "I was baking bread when you arrived. Would you like some coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be great, thank you," Richard replied, still standing, feeling too large for the small, intimate space. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, and Richard finally sat on the couch. He picked up one of the handmade pillows. It had small embroidered flowers in cross-stitch. He pictured Sophie learning how to embroider under her grandmother's patient guidance. His eyes wandered around the room, soaking in details that told a story. A framed photo on the shelf showed a younger Margaret holding a baby, their daughter. No, her daughter, Laura, he assumed. On a side table sat an old record player. He recalled how Margaret loved music, always humming in the mornings. He wondered if she still had that sweet voice. "I hope the girls didn't give you too much trouble," Margaret said from the kitchen. "They can be quite energetic." "No, they were surprisingly easy," Richard said, pausing to choose his words carefully. "Sophie is very responsible for her age. She had to grow up fast," Margaret answered, returning with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Richard and sat on the other end of the couch, close enough to converse, far enough to keep a safe distance. Ever since her mother passed, she's taken on the caregiver role for her sister. I try to let her still be a child, but her voice faltered slightly. She sipped her coffee, gathering herself. "I'm sorry about your daughter," Richard said gently. "The girls mentioned she passed away." Margaret nodded, a sad smile crossing her face. Laura, she was 27. Cancer. It happened so quickly. Diagnosis to the end was only 8 months. Richard felt a knot in his throat. I had no idea. I'm truly sorry. There was no way you could have known, she replied simply. A silence settled between them, filled only by the distant chatter of the girls in the other room. The card, Richard began. Yes, the card, Margaret smiled softly. I'd been wanting to send it to you for a while, but never found the courage. Then yesterday, I saw on the local news a story about you donating to that children's hospital. It seemed like the right moment. Richard remembered the donation, a calculated gesture suggested by his PR department, nothing more. Why now, after all these years? He asked, meeting her gaze. Margaret held her cup with both hands, as if seeking warmth. When you go through certain things, losing a daughter, raising 2 granddaughters alone, you start seeing life differently, she said. Old grudges seem small compared to what really matters. And I always wondered how you were if you'd found happiness. Her honesty disarmed him completely. Richard lowered his eyes to his coffee. I've done well, actually. The companies are doing great. We expanded to Asia last year and... He stopped, hearing how empty and mechanical his words sounded. That wasn't what she was asking. I never married, he finally admitted. Margaret took that in silently. I got married, she said after a moment. Thomas was a good man. Her civil engineer. He died 4 years ago, a heart attack. I'm sorry, Richard said again, feeling how inadequate the words sounded. It was a good marriage, Margaret continued. It wasn't like us, of course, that youthful intensity, but it was good, stable. He loved Laura as if she were his own daughter. Richard felt a pang at the thought of another man raising Margaret's child, a child who might have been theirs in another life, another choice. Did you ever marry? Margaret asked. I always thought you'd eventually start a family. Richard shook his head. I had relationships over the years, but nothing serious enough. Work always came first. He hesitated before adding, or maybe that was just an excuse. Margaret's eyes met his briefly, and there was something there. Understanding, perhaps. Or pity. Richard wasn't sure which was worse. What was Laura like? Was she like you? He asked, changing the subject. Margaret's face lit up with that special maternal pride. In many ways, yes. Stubborn like me, she laughed softly. But she had a kindness from her father. Thomas taught her to see beauty in small things. She became a photographer, you know? Some of the pictures on the wall are hers. Richard looked at the framed images, landscapes captured with a sensitive eye for light and shadow. Everyday moments turned into art through a careful lens. She had talent, he said sincerely. Yes, she did, Margaret agreed, her eyes glistening. She was just beginning to be recognized when she got sick. The girls returned, now in dry, colorful clothes. Sophie carried a photo album. Grandma, can we show Mr. Richard pictures of Mommy? She asked, sitting between them on the couch, while Ellie climbed onto Margaret's lap. Margaret looked at Richard, a silent question in her eyes. I'd like to see them, if that's okay, he answered, realizing he genuinely wanted to know this part of Margaret's life he'd missed. Sophie eagerly opened the album. The first photos showed a newborn baby in the arms of a much younger Margaret. That's Mommy when she was a baby, Sophie explained. Her name was Laura. Richard took in the young mother in the photo. She couldn't have been more than 20. Probably about a year after he left, he calculated. The thought made his stomach clench. She was quite a surprise, Margaret commented, gently brushing Ellie's hair. I found out I was pregnant just a month after you, after we separated. You were? Laura was... Richard couldn't finish the question. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I tried to find you at first. I called your parents, but they said you had gone abroad for that internship. I planned to tell you when you came back, but then... I never came back, Richard finished, feeling the weight of 25 years of mistakes crashing down on him. Margaret, I didn't know if I'd known... It doesn't matter now, she gently cut him off. It was a long time ago. I did what I believed was right then, and Thomas was a wonderful father to Laura. Richard tried to process this new reality. He had a daughter. He had had a daughter whom he never met. A daughter who grew up, became a photographer, got married, had children, fell ill and died, all without him even knowing she existed. Sophie, oblivious to the emotional earthquake she had just triggered, kept flipping the album's pages. Here's Mommy learning to walk, and here she is at school. Grandma says she was really smart. Laura was brilliant, Margaret agreed. Always reading, always curious. Remember how you used to love explaining things, Richard? She was the same. She needed to know how everything worked. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He could see traces of himself in some of the photos now. The shape of her eyes, her slightly crooked smile. How had he never noticed before? And this is Mommy with Daddy on their wedding day. Sophie pointed to a photo of Laura, now a young woman, next to a man with a broad grin. Your dad looks happy here, Richard commented carefully, trying to regain composure. A quick look passed between Sophie and Margaret. He was happy at first, Sophie said with a wisdom far beyond her 5 years. But then he got sad and angry all the time. And then he left. That was a little after Laura died, Margaret explained gently. Greg couldn't handle the loss and the responsibility of 2 small children. One day, he simply packed his bags and said he needed time. That was almost 2 years ago. We haven't heard from him since. Richard felt a surge of anger at a man who would abandon these children when they needed him most. How could anyone leave Sophie and Ellie behind? Then, with a jolt of recognition, he realized he had done almost the same thing. He left Margaret when she needed him most, unaware that he was also leaving behind an unborn daughter. Are you okay financially? I mean, the words slipped out before he could stop them. Margaret lifted her chin slightly, a familiar gesture of pride. We manage. The flower shop doesn't earn much, but I do sewing work at night and weekends. We have enough for what matters. Richard glanced around, noticing now what he'd missed earlier. The small old space heater, the carefully mended curtains, the well-kept but clearly worn toys. They managed, but with difficulty. Grandma makes the best dresses, Ellie said, stroking the hem of her homemade skirt. This one has hidden pockets. Impressive, Richard remarked, genuinely admiring Margaret's skill. It's just basic sewing, she smiled, though she seemed pleased by the compliment. Laura always liked clothes with pockets, so I try to do the same for the girls. Conversation flowed more easily then, with the children serving as a bridge between 2 adults who had so much to say and yet struggled to find the right words. Sophie talked about school. Ellie showed off her favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit worn by time. Richard watched Margaret interact with her granddaughters. The patience with which she answered Ellie's questions, the gentle way she corrected Sophie when she interrupted, her automatic gestures of tucking a stray hair behind an ear or straightening a sleeve. There was a quiet strength in her he didn't recall before, or maybe it had always been there, and in his youth he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. How do you do it? He asked suddenly. Margaret looked at him, puzzled. Do what? All of this, handling, everything. The loss, the responsibilities, moving on. Margaret pondered for a moment, her eyes drifting over the small apartment and settling on the girls playing on the rug. One day at a time, she finally replied. When I lost Laura, I thought I'd never breathe again. But then there were these 2 little girls who depended on me. They needed me to keep going. So I kept going. Her voice was calm but firm, a tone that spoke of internal battles fought and won at an invisible cost. At first, you do it because you have to. Then you realize life goes on, somehow. Different, but it goes on. Richard felt a deep admiration for her, for the young woman she had been, making choices that changed both their lives, and for the strong person she had become, facing consequences he could barely imagine. As the morning wore on, Richard grew more comfortable in that small apartment. There was something about its warm simplicity, the girls' laughter, and Margaret's gentle manner that made him feel part of something real for the first time in years. When Margaret rose to check on the bread in the oven, the delicious aroma filled the living room. Richard realized he'd been there for 3 hours and hadn't even noticed the time pass. On any other day, he would have checked his phone 100 times by now, answered dozens of emails and made several calls. Would you like to stay for lunch? Margaret asked, returning from the kitchen. It's nothing fancy, Just vegetable soup and the fresh bread I just took out of the oven. Richard should refuse. He had work, commitments, a structured life. But looking at Margaret, at the children playing on the rug, at this simple but full life they had built, he realized he didn't want to leave. "I'd love to," he answered. And Margaret's surprise quickly gave way to a soft smile, the same one that, decades ago, made his heart skip a beat. As she returned to the kitchen, Richard thought of all the crucial meetings he had conducted, the million-dollar contracts he had negotiated, the strategic acquisitions he had orchestrated. None of them felt as meaningful as what Margaret had created here, a true home full of love even amid devastating losses. And there, sitting on the blue couch with handmade pillows, surrounded by the warmth of a family not his own but strangely welcoming him, Richard Donovan, the lonely billionaire who had everything yet nothing, finally understood what the card meant. He really had forgotten how to receive love, and maybe, just maybe, after all these years, there was still time to learn again. Richard closed the front door and stood still in the entry hall of his mansion. After leaving Margaret's apartment, he'd driven automatically, barely aware of the route. Now at home, the contrast hit him like a blow. Silence. An oppressive, almost tangible silence. His footsteps echoed on the marble floors as he walked through the corridors. The house had never felt so empty, so excessively large. The white walls, the elegant furniture, the expensive artwork, it all seemed strangely lifeless, like an elaborate stage for a play with no actors. He entered the main living room and tossed his keys onto the coffee table. The metallic clang reverberated, emphasizing the absence of other sounds. No childish voices, no smell of freshly baked bread, no laughter, only the distant ticking of an antique clock. Richard sat on the Italian leather sofa that cost more than a luxury car. He closed his eyes and saw Margaret's apartment. Small, simple, with flowers in improvised vases and pictures on the walls. A real home. "What have I built here?" he murmured, looking around. He got up restlessly and walked over to the window overlooking his perfectly manicured garden. He remembered Sophie proudly showing her drawings, Ellie with her stuffed rabbit, Margaret with flour on her hands. Laura, a daughter he never met. Her daughter who grew up fatherless because he had left, determined to conquer the world, and he did. But at what cost? His phone vibrated. It was Janet, his assistant, reminding him of a meeting with Korean investors the next day. Another acquisition, another deal, more zeros in his bank account. Richard stared at the screen, feeling a strange detachment. These meetings, once so crucial, now felt hollow. In his office, he turned on his computer and tried to work. There were reports to evaluate, contracts to review, important decisions to make. But his mind kept going back to that small apartment on Rose Garden Street, to the simple lunch they shared, to the moment he said goodbye while Margaret thanked him softly. The report on his screen talked about cost-cutting and streamlining. Richard read the recommendation: shut down a factory in the countryside and move production abroad. 300 employees would lose their jobs, but profits would increase by 18%. A week ago, he would have approved it without a second thought. Now, he thought about those 300 employees. Families like Margaret's, people working to support their children or grandchildren. Richard closed the laptop with a snap. He poured himself a drink and wandered through the house, stopping in rooms he rarely visited. The guest room where the girls had slept still had the disheveled sheets. In the bathroom, a tiny toothbrush was left behind. In the living room, Sophie's drawing lay on the coffee table. A real home should have these traces of life, he thought, not this sterile perfection. He stopped before a framed photograph on the wall, him standing beside an important politician during an awards ceremony. Both men wearing formal smiles. Richard couldn't even recall the event or why he'd been honored. In Margaret's apartment, every photo told a story: birthdays, graduations, Laura's milestones. 40 years spent building an empire. For what? For whom? Returning to the sofa, he sat down, holding his glass too tightly. He remembered the day he left Margaret to accept that internship abroad. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he'd called it. "I can't turn it down," she had cried, asked him to stay, talked about building something together. He'd called her selfish. "You don't understand," he'd said. "This is my future." And now, looking back, he saw with painful clarity that his future had turned into exactly this: a huge empty house, overflowing bank accounts, and nobody to share any of it with. In Margaret's apartment, he had felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: belonging. For a few hours, he'd been part of something real. He turned on the TV to fill the silence. A news anchor was talking about the weather, her artificial smile frozen on her face. Richard turned up the volume, but he didn't care about the forecast. He just wanted a human voice. In his pocket, Margaret's red card still accompanied him. He pulled it out and reread the message. "You deserve love, even if you've forgotten how to receive it." He looked at his phone. It would be so simple to call her, to hear her voice again, to ask if he could visit Sophie and Ellie. But what could he offer them? What did he know about being a father, or a grandfather, or even a friend? For the first time, the imposing mansion he had built did not feel like a symbol of success, but a self-imposed prison. The famous paintings on the walls, the Persian carpets, the antiques, none of it truly mattered. Richard stood and walked to the light switch. He turned off the living room lights and stood in the darkness, listening to the absolute silence of the house. It wasn't peace he felt, but emptiness. "Who am I?" he asked aloud, and the question echoed unanswered through the empty corridors of the mansion. The first visit happened 3 days later. Richard stopped by the flower shop, hesitating at the entrance. Through the glass, he saw Margaret helping a customer, carefully arranging flowers with precise, gentle movements. He took a deep breath and went inside, making the little bell above the door jingle. Margaret looked up, surprised. A small smile appeared on her lips, as if she had been waiting for him without knowing it. "Richard." "Hello? I hope I'm not disturbing," he said, feeling strangely nervous. He, who conducted meetings with CEOs and politicians without flinching, now felt his palms sweating. "Not at all. I'm just finishing up with Mrs. Peterson here." The older woman eyed Richard curiously, then looked at Margaret, clearly intrigued by the dynamic between them. After paying for her arrangement, she left, not without casting a meaningful glance Margaret's way. "Gossip will run wild around here," Margaret said with a light laugh. "Sorry about that," Richard said. "Don't worry. In a week, some other news will take its place." She wiped her hands on her flower-patterned apron. "What brings you here?" Richard held out a small package. "I found this in the guest room. I think it's Ellie's." It was the stuffed rabbit, forgotten among the sheets. "Oh, Mr. Hops, she's been crying for him. Thank you." Margaret took the toy, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Would you like to stop by our place later to give it to her personally?" "She'd be so happy to see you." Richard agreed at once, and that first visit led to another and another, until it became part of his routine. In the following weeks, Richard began rearranging his life to include those visits. He delegated non-essential meetings, rescheduled international commitments, ignored calls he once deemed top priority. He adjusted his schedule to spend afternoons on Rose Garden Street, initially with excuses: documents needing signatures, forgotten items, questions about Laura. But soon there were no more pretexts, just the simple truth. He wanted to be there. At his office, he surprised Janet, his longtime assistant, with new instructions. "Cancel the trip to Tokyo. Tell them I'll attend via video conference." "Mr. Donovan, Mr. Nakamura insisted that your presence is essential." "It isn't," Richard interrupted. "They want my signature on the contract, not my physical presence. Besides, I have commitments here that can't be postponed." Janet looked at him as though he'd grown a second head. In 20 years working for Richard, she had never seen him prioritize anything over business. "Commitments?" she ventured to ask. Richard hesitated. "Personal," he finally said. "And Janet, please rearrange my schedule to leave Tuesday and Thursday afternoons free." As he walked out, he heard Janet mutter something about a midlife crisis, but he didn't care. For the first time in decades, he felt his priorities were exactly where they should be. At the flower shop, Richard discovered a new routine. He arrived in the late afternoon, when it was less busy, and talked to Margaret as she finished her last arrangements of the day. Then they walked together to her apartment. chatting about the day, the girls, and simple things that had never fit into his old life. Sometimes, he offered to pick Sophie up from school. The first time was a fiasco. He parked the Mercedes right at the gate, causing a stir among parents and teachers. Sophie, embarrassed, asked him to park around the corner next time. Richard complied, appreciating her direct honesty. "Why do you have such a big car?" she asked one afternoon on the drive home. "Because I thought I needed to show people I was successful," he replied, surprising himself with his frankness. Sophie nodded as though she perfectly understood adult vanity. "Grandma says real success doesn't need to be flaunted." Her words stayed with him for days. The following week, he replaced the Mercedes with a more modest sedan. At the apartment, Richard found little ways to help out. At first, simple tasks, changing a burnt-out light bulb, fixing a dripping faucet, carrying heavy groceries. Tasks Margaret could manage alone, but which felt so right when he did them. One evening, he arrived to find Margaret struggling with an old sewing machine that kept jamming. "Can I take a look?" he offered. "Do you know anything about sewing machines?" she asked skeptically. "No," he admitted with a smile, "but I do know basic mechanics." He spent almost 2 hours disassembling, cleaning, and adjusting the mechanism, while Margaret watched patiently. When he finally got it working, he felt a pride no corporate acquisition had ever given him. "You seem pleased," Margaret remarked. "I am. It's good to fix something with your own hands, to see the immediate result." Margaret smiled, and in her smile was more than gratitude. There was understanding. With the girls, the connection was even more surprising. Ellie, initially shy, soon adopted him as a sort of honorary grandpa. Richard, who had always found small children indecipherable, discovered that Ellie's straightforwardness was refreshing. "Why is your house so big if you live alone?" she asked once. "Because I thought a big house would make me happy," he said. "Did it?" Richard pondered for a moment. "No. That just gave me more empty space." Sophie was more observant, more cautious in her acceptance. Richard respected that, respected how she protected her sister and grandmother. Gradually, he earned her trust, not with expensive gifts, as he might have done before, but with genuine time and attention. One rainy afternoon, he found her struggling with math homework. "Need help?" he offered, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. "It's too hard," Sophie complained. "I don't understand fractions." Richard, who dealt effortlessly with complex financial equations, rediscovered the joy of explaining basic concepts. He grabbed apples from the fruit bowl, sliced them into parts, turned abstract numbers into something tangible Sophie could hold and see. Her eyes lit up when she finally got it. "That's way easier than how my teacher explained." "Sometimes we just need to see things from a different angle," he said, not realizing how his own words reflected the changes in his own life. Tuesdays and Thursdays became his favorite days. He arrived after lunch and stayed until after dinner, helping with homework, taking the girls to the park, fixing little things in the apartment. One Thursday, Richard noticed Margaret watching him while he and the girls played a board game in the living room. There was something in her expression, a mix of surprise and something deeper he couldn't identify. "What is it?" he asked when the girls went to get more cookies. "I'm just noticing the changes," she replied. "In me. Yes, you're more present, more patient, more like the Richard I knew long ago." The observation moved him deeply. It was true. He felt more connected with the younger version of himself, before ambition and success had completely defined him. At the office, people noticed the changes too. His partner, Charles, confronted him after a meeting in which Richard had delegated a key negotiation. "What's going on, Richard? You never let anyone else lead the crucial deals." "I'm reorganizing my priorities." Charles narrowed his eyes. "Does it have to do with those visits you've been making to that residential neighborhood? Janet mentioned you block out entire afternoons." Richard felt a flash of irritation. "My personal life is not the company's business. It is when it affects your performance. This isn't the Richard Donovan I've known for 20 years. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to change," Richard replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his conviction. "I've been doing things the same way for too long, Charles." The next day, Richard did something he'd never dreamed of. He called his legal team and began the process of donating a significant portion of his wealth to charity. He included a children's hospital specializing in oncology, Thinking of Laura, and a foundation supporting single-parent families, Thinking of Margaret. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Donovan?" asked his lawyer, shocked by the sums involved. "That's almost 30% of your net worth." "I'm absolutely sure," he replied. "And prepare the documents for creating an educational foundation for underprivileged children. Full scholarships, from elementary school through college." Leaving that meeting, Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Money had never been an issue for him, but now he realized that hoarding wealth obsessively was a poor substitute for what really mattered. The following week, he arrived at Margaret's apartment with a special project in mind. He brought materials to teach the girls how to make paper boats, a skill his own grandfather had taught him as a child, which he surprisingly still remembered. Seated at the kitchen table, with colored paper spread around, Richard patiently demonstrated the folds. Ellie grew frustrated quickly, crumpling up her attempts, but Sophie followed the instructions with determination. "Like this?" she asked, holding up a creation that looked more like a crashed airplane. "Almost," he said gently. "Let me show you again." He took her small hands in his and guided her fingers through the folds. The sensation of teaching something, passing on knowledge, even something so simple, stirred something deep inside him. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, her eyes glistening. "What's wrong?" Richard asked later, when the girls went out to float their paper boats in the small courtyard fountain. "My father used to do that," she said softly. "Paper boats for Laura when she was little. They'd spend hours playing together." Richard felt the weight of her words. Generations connected by simple gestures, shared moments, everything he had missed and everything he was now trying, in some way, to reclaim. "Do you know what Sophie asked me yesterday?" Margaret continued. "She wanted to know if you were her grandpa too. How do you explain our story to a 5-year-old? What did you tell her?" "The truth in a simplified way, that we were special friends a long time ago. We drifted apart, and now we found each other again." She paused. "She asked if you're going to leave again." The question hit him like a punch. Would he leave? Return to his old life, abandoning this new world he'd discovered? "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." That evening, driving back to his mansion, Richard made a decision. He called Charles. "I want to reduce my involvement in the company's daily operations," he announced abruptly. "I'll remain as chairman of the board, but I'd like to appoint you as the operational CEO." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "Is this final?" Charles asked at last. "Completely. The paperwork will be on your desk tomorrow." Hanging up, Richard felt a freedom he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't retirement. He would still have a say in major decisions, still keep part of his professional identity. But now there would be room for more. Afternoons with Sophie and Ellie, quiet conversations with Margaret, discovering who he was beyond the money and successes. Back home, for the first time in decades, he didn't turn on his computer to check emails. Instead, he sat in an armchair with a novel Margaret had mentioned. It was a simple story with no grand literary ambitions, but he found himself absorbed in it, in the forgotten pleasure of reading purely for enjoyment. He reflected on the small changes he was making, on the person he was rediscovering beneath layers of ambition and success. He wasn't the young Richard anymore. He carried the weight of experience, choices, and regrets, but something genuine was emerging, something that had been dormant too long. The next day, he woke with renewed purpose. He went to a toy store and bought a kit of miniature boats to build with the girls over the weekend. It wasn't expensive or flashy. It was a promise of shared time, of creating memories together. And that, Richard realized, was the real luxury his money had never been able to buy. It was just 2 weeks until Christmas. The entire city seemed transformed. Shop windows decked out, colored lights in the park trees, Christmas music in the stores. A festive mood that Richard observed somewhat from a distance, as if watching a movie rather than living it. The previous Sunday, he had taken Sophie and Ellie to the mall. Not his favorite place. He hated crowds, but the girls had insisted so much he couldn't refuse. They wanted to see the decorations, Santa Claus, the lights. "Look, mister." "Richard," Sophie pointed to a storefront overflowing with Christmas ornaments. "We have a nativity set at home, but smaller." "We already put up our tree," Ellie announced proudly, "and Grandma let us hang the most colorful ornaments." Richard just smiled as he bought them hot chocolate. The girls chatted excitedly about their Christmas preparations. The wreaths Grandma was making, the stockings on the wall, since they had no fireplace, the star-shaped cookies they planned to bake. "What about you, Mr. Richard? Did you put up your tree yet?" Sophie asked, wiping a chocolate mustache from her upper lip. "I don't put up a Christmas tree," he replied casually. The two girls stared at him with utter shock, as if he'd just confessed to a terrible crime. "No tree." Ellie's eyes grew wide. "But how will Santa know where to leave presents?" Richard didn't know how to respond. In his house, Christmas was just another date on the calendar, maybe with a formal call to his brother in Europe and a slightly fancier dinner prepared by his housekeeper. He'd never stopped to think how odd his lack of celebration might seem to someone else. On the drive back, the girls were unusually quiet. Dropping them off at their apartment, Sophie gave Margaret a meaningful look before running inside with Ellie. Margaret smiled with a knowing expression. Clearly the girls were plotting something. "Thanks for taking them," Margaret said. "Looks like they had fun." "I think they were shocked that I don't have any Christmas decorations," Richard admitted with a small laugh. Margaret nodded. "For children, these traditions are important. They create memories, you know, Laura used to say that. How little family rituals anchor us in time, give us a sense of continuity." The next day, Richard was in his home office reviewing some documents when the doorbell rang. As he opened the door, he found Margaret, Sophie, and Ellie all bundled up and smiling, carrying several bags. "Surprise!" the girls shouted in unison. "What's this?" Richard asked, genuinely confused. "A Christmas intervention," declared Sophie with solemnity. "You need the Christmas spirit, togetherness and family. We decided your house shouldn't go undecorated," Margaret explained, looking slightly embarrassed. The girls insisted. "I hope you don't mind." How could he mind? The past few months with them had added more color to his life than the last 30 years combined. "I don't have any ornaments," he pointed out, letting them in. "We brought some," Sophie replied, displaying one of the bags. "But it's not enough for such a big house. We'll need to buy more." And so on a cold December afternoon, Richard Donovan found himself driving to the biggest Christmas decor store in town with two excited children in the back seat and a smiling Margaret by his side. The store was a veritable Christmas wonderland. Trees of all sizes, lights flashing in hypnotic patterns, ornaments for every taste. Richard, used to austere corporate environments, felt momentarily disoriented by the explosion of colors and sparkle. "Which tree do you want?" Margaret asked, as the girls ran back and forth, pointing excitedly at different items. "Honestly, I have no idea," he confessed. "I've never bought one before." "Never?" Margaret's surprise was clear. "Not even when you were a kid?" Richard hesitated. "My parents weren't big on celebrations. Christmas was just a formal dinner and a few practical gifts." Margaret's expression softened, not pity but understanding. "Then this will be your first real tree. It has to be special." In the end, it wasn't Richard who chose, but Sophie and Ellie. They opted for a majestic pine, tall enough to be impressive but not so enormous as to be ostentatious. "Green goes with everything," Sophie said seriously as she helped pick ornaments, "and we need lots of lights. Grandma says the lights remind us that even in the darkest days, there's always brightness and hope." Their cart filled quickly. Colorful baubles, little angels, glittering stars, silver ribbons, and, of course, multiple boxes of lights. Richard, who might have questioned the need for so many items before, simply watched with fascination at how much joy each choice brought the girls. At the checkout, when the clerk announced the total, Richard didn't even blink. What was money compared to the radiant look on Sophie and Ellie's faces? Margaret, however, appeared uneasy about the cost. "Richard, this is—" she began to protest. "It's Christmas," he interrupted gently, "and I'm apparently 25 years late on decorations." Back at the mansion, the real work began. Richard never imagined decorating for Christmas could be so complicated and so fun. Under Sophie's firm guidance, who seemed to have a very clear artistic vision for a 5-year-old, they transformed the main living room. Ellie was in charge of sorting ornaments by color, a task she took extremely seriously, occasionally interrupted by exclamations like, "Look how this one sparkles," or "This one has a little face on it." Margaret prepared hot chocolate in the kitchen while Richard struggled with the lights, trying to untangle them amid the girls' laughter. "Not like that," Sophie insisted, trying to help. "You have to test them first, then put them on the tree." When they finally managed to get the tree upright and hung the first ornaments, Richard realized something unusual. He was enjoying himself. Genuinely. It wasn't the calculated satisfaction of closing a lucrative deal or the polite appreciation of a night at the opera. It was simple, almost childlike joy. "Mr. Richard, you're smiling," Ellie observed, surprised. "Am I?" he replied, suddenly aware that, yes, he was smiling, and even more surprising, he couldn't stop. The afternoon flew by in a whirl of laughter, Christmas carols that Margaret played, and small mishaps like when Ellie dropped a glass ornament, causing a moment of tense silence, soon replaced by Richard's "It's okay, we have plenty more," to everyone's astonishment, including his own. By nightfall, the job was done. The tree stood resplendent in the center of the room, covered in lights and ornaments. They'd hung garlands on the doors, set little arrangements on the tables, and even placed colored lights outside the house. The four of them stepped out into the front yard to admire their handiwork. The mansion, once so austere and cold, now glowed warmly and festively, standing out on the already decorated street. "It's beautiful," Sophie whispered, her small hand clutching Richard's tightly. "The best tree ever," Ellie agreed, jumping with excitement. Richard looked at Margaret, who watched the scene with a serene smile. There was a silent question in her eyes, and he knew exactly what it was. "Would you stay for dinner?" he invited. "We could order something." "Even better," Margaret replied. "We can cook together. The girls love making Christmas cookies." As they headed back inside, Richard stole one last glance at his transformed home. For the first time, it felt like a real home, not because of its grandeur or luxury, but because of the joy now shining in every glowing window. Inside and out, Richard's house now truly glimmered, warmed by the real spirit of Christmas he had forgotten for so long. Unity, family, and the simple pleasure of being with those who matter. Richard's house kept its Christmas glow, both inside and out. The colored lights twinkled softly on the exterior each evening, and the grand tree in the living room remained majestic, its ornaments carefully placed. Richard often caught himself gazing at it, as if still not believing how much his house and his life had changed. It was a Wednesday morning when he got the call. The day had started like any other. He was in his office, reviewing contracts, planning to finish in time to pick Sophie up from school, as promised. His phone rang, and seeing Margaret's name on the screen, he felt that now familiar warmth. "Hi, Margaret," he answered, smiling, but it wasn't Margaret's voice on the other end. "Mr. Richard." It was Sophie, her small voice trembling. "Grandma fell." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "Fell? What do you mean? Fell? Where are you?" "At home. Grandma was sorting clothes, and suddenly she fell on the floor. She won't wake up, Mr. Richard." Panic flooded her voice, yet she managed a calm that was astonishing for a 5-year-old. "Sophie, listen carefully. Did you call 911? "I don't know the number," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm calling right now. Don't hang up your grandma's phone, okay? I'll be there as soon as I can." Richard barely remembered grabbing his keys before rushing to the car. Driving at a dangerous speed, he dialed emergency services, giving Margaret's address. A woman in her 50s, unconscious. 2 young children are with her. The route usually took 20 minutes. He made it in under 10. He parked haphazardly in front of the modest building and ran toward apartment 2. The door was unlocked. Sophie waited for him in the hallway, clutching Ellie's hand. Both had tear-stained faces and frightened expressions. "She's there," Sophie pointed to the bedroom. Richard found Margaret collapsed between the bed and the dresser, her face pale, though thankfully she was still breathing. He knelt beside her, gently touching her cheek. "Margaret? Margaret? Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Richard checked her pulse. It was weak, but there. The girls stood at the doorway, Ellie half hidden behind Sophie. "Is Grandma going to be okay?" Ellie asked in a whisper. Richard turned to them, forcing a confident expression he didn't feel. "She's going to be fine. The ambulance is on its way, and the doctors will help her." Sirens soon echoed down the street. The paramedics came in, efficient and quick, asking questions Richard tried to answer, though he knew little about Margaret's medical history. "Does she have any known conditions?" "Not that I know of." "Any regular medications?" "I'm not sure." "Grandma takes a pill in the morning," Sophie offered, surprising Richard. "The bottle is in the top kitchen drawer." Richard ran to fetch it, while the paramedics prepared Margaret for transport. It was a simple prescription bottle with a name he didn't recognize. On the way to the hospital, Richard held Ellie in his lap, while Sophie sat rigidly beside him, clutching his hand. He watched the ambulance ahead, its lights flashing relentlessly against the overcast afternoon sky. "Everything's going to be fine," he repeated, as much for the girls as for himself. At the hospital, the wait was agonizing. Margaret was taken for immediate tests while Richard and the girls remained in the waiting area. He tried distracting them with stories and improvised games, but his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. After an hour that felt like forever, a middle-aged doctor approached. "Family of Margaret Taylor." Richard stood up, Ellie still in his arms and Sophie clinging to his leg. "That's us, He hesitated, unsure how to define himself. "They're her granddaughters." "How is she?" The doctor eyed the children and subtly gestured for Richard to step aside. Richard knelt beside the girls. "Sit here for a minute, okay? I need to talk to the doctor about Grandma and I'll be right back." Sophie nodded solemnly, taking responsibility for Ellie, while Richard followed the doctor a short distance away. "Mr. Donovan." "Richard Donovan." "Mr. Donovan, Ms. Taylor is stable now, but her fainting spell was caused by a heart condition that seems to have been unnoticed until now." Richard felt the ground crumble beneath him. "A heart condition. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's a disease that thickens the heart muscle, making it harder to pump blood. The good news is we caught it relatively early, and there are effective treatments. The bad news is it's a chronic condition requiring ongoing medication and regular follow-up." The doctor's words seemed distant. Richard thought of Margaret's husband, who'd died of a heart attack, of Laura, taken so young by illness, and now Margaret. Will she be okay?" he managed. "With proper treatment, yes, but she'll need to reduce stress, rest more, take her meds correctly. She'll need constant medical supervision." Richard nodded, trying to absorb it all. "May I see her?" "Of course, but just for a few minutes. She's still weak." In the hospital room, Margaret looked terribly small against the white sheets. Monitors beeped softly beside the bed, displaying steady green lines of her heartbeat. Richard entered alone first, leaving the girls with a kind nurse who offered them hot chocolate and cookies. He approached cautiously, almost fearful. Margaret opened her eyes, sensing his presence. "Richard," she said weakly. "I'm here," he replied, taking her hand. She felt so fragile. A knot formed in his throat. "The girls are fine, don't worry." Margaret tried to smile. "Sophie called you." "Yes, she was very brave." Richard hesitated before continuing. "The doctor told me about your heart." "Ah," she sighed. "I suspected something was off. I've been so tired lately." "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, a touch of desperation in his voice. "And worry everyone for nothing. That's not my style." She tried to laugh, but it came out frail. "Besides, we've been having such good days lately. I didn't want to spoil that." Richard clasped her hand tighter, struggling with a wave of emotions. The fear he felt when Sophie called, the terror during the drive, the anguish in the waiting room, all culminating in a sharp realization he could no longer ignore. "Margaret," he began, voice thick with emotion, "when Sophie called today, I felt like my world was collapsing. I realized that..." He stopped, inhaled deeply. and went on with determination. "Now that I've found you again, I can't lose you. Not again." The words flowed straight from his heart, raw and unfiltered, the simplest and scariest truth he'd ever admitted. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, tears filling her eyes. Then, with a faint smile that lit up her tired face, she replied, "Then stay." 2 days later, Margaret was discharged with a list of medical recommendations, prescribed medications, and scheduled appointments. Richard meticulously organized everything, creating medication schedules that both amused and exasperated Margaret and the girls. "I'm not dying, Richard," Margaret teased as he insisted on carrying even her small hospital bag. "It's a manageable condition." "I know," he said, "but let's do everything right." Back at her apartment, he had already rearranged the bedroom furniture to accommodate her needs, bought a new orthopedic mattress for comfort, and filled the fridge with healthy, low-sodium foods per the doctor's orders. Margaret looked around, surprised by all the changes. "You did all this in 2 days." "The girls helped," he said, nodding at Sophie and Ellie, who grinned proudly. "They were great interior design consultants." "I chose the flowers," Ellie announced, pointing to vases strategically placed around the rooms. "And I helped organize the meds," Sophie added. In the days that followed, they established a new routine. Richard arrived early every morning, after spending the night at his mansion. He made breakfast for everyone, helped the girls get ready for school, and dropped them off while Margaret rested a bit longer. During the day, he worked remotely from the small apartment, joining video conferences from the sofa or the kitchen table. His colleagues noticed the new setting, but no one dared comment. Richard Donovan of a few months ago would have fired anyone who questioned his personal choices. In the afternoons, he picked the girls up from school, helped with homework, and prepared dinner. It was a completely different life from what he'd lived for decades, yet it felt as if he were finally doing what he was meant to do. Margaret watched it all with a mix of gratitude and admiration. After the first week, when she felt a bit stronger, she spoke up while he was washing dishes after dinner. "You don't have to do all this, Richard. I don't want to be a burden." Richard turned to her, drying his hands on a dish towel. "You're not a burden. You never could be. Your life is on hold because of me. Your house, your work. My life is finally beginning," he corrected softly. "And I'm not just doing this for you, I'm doing it for me, too. For us." That evening, the girls asked Richard to read them a bedtime story. Sitting on the edge of the bed they shared, with a fairy tale book in his hands, Richard felt a sense of wholeness he couldn't remember feeling before. When he finished, Sophie regarded him with her big, serious eyes. "You're going to stay with us forever now, aren't you, Grandpa Richard?" The title took him by surprise. Grandpa Richard. The words echoed in his chest like a bell. "Sophie," Margaret interjected from the doorway, where she was watching. "Mr. Richard isn't really your—" "I'd love that," Richard interrupted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'd love to be your grandpa if that's okay." Ellie, already half asleep, mumbled something like "Grandpa Rich" before turning over on her pillow. Sophie smiled, satisfied, and stretched out her arms for a good-night hug. Later, with the girls asleep, Richard and Margaret sat on the apartment's small balcony. The night was clear, and a few stars shone despite the city lights. You don't mind?" Margaret asked. "What Sophie said?" Richard shook his head. "Actually, it's the best gift I've ever received." He paused, looking up at the sky. "I never thought of having children. I always figured it was better that way, that I didn't have what it takes to be a father. And now I see how wrong I was. How much I missed." He turned to Margaret, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "But I also see that maybe it's not too late." Margaret smiled that gentle smile he was beginning to love all over again. "It's never too late for family, Richard." Family. The word echoed in his mind like a promise. He who had built financial empires, conquered markets, and amassed wealth beyond most people's imagination, had never glimpsed his greatest treasure, this moment, this feeling of belonging, these people. In the following weeks, Margaret steadily recovered. The initial scare gave way to careful management of her condition. Richard learned every detail of her medications, every symptom to watch for, every precaution to take. He became an amateur expert in cardiomyopathy, reading medical articles late into the night. Without noticing, he started sleeping on the apartment sofa more often than in his own bed. His clothes gradually moved into Margaret's small closet. His laptop became a permanent fixture on the kitchen table. One night, while helping Sophie with a solar system model for school, styrofoam balls painted like planets, Richard realized he was genuinely happy. Not the fleeting happiness of closing a big deal or buying something luxurious, but a deep, abiding joy woven into the day-to-day moments. Margaret entered with a tray of tea, catching Richard and Sophie engrossed in their project, while Ellie dozed on the couch with her stuffed rabbit. She smiled softly. "What?" Richard asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking how life can take such unexpected turns." Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. Who could have imagined just a few months ago that the once lonely billionaire would be here, gluing tiny stars onto a school project, juggling heart medications and bedtime stories? "Grandpa, pass the glue," Sophie said, utterly unaware of the emotional weight of the moment. Richard obliged, feeling a warm glow in his chest at hearing that word again. Grandpa. That was who he was now. Not just a CEO, investor, or businessman. He was Grandpa Richard, who told stories, fixed toys, checked homework, and knew exactly how Margaret liked her tea. He was living something he never knew he so desperately wanted: a family. The idea came on a Sunday afternoon. Richard was flipping through a magazine absent-mindedly, while Margaret knitted on the small blue couch. Sophie and Ellie played on the rug, building a miniature city with toy blocks. The apartment, though cozy, felt smaller by the day. Richard's belongings had gradually piled up. An extra toothbrush, clothes, books, his laptop. The couch he slept on was far too short for him, but he never complained. Margaret looked up from her knitting, catching him massaging his neck to ease the stiffness of another night on the makeshift bed. "You should go home and sleep in a real bed tonight," she suggested with a sympathetic smile. Richard put the magazine down. "This is my home now," he replied simply. Then, as though the thought had just occurred to him, he added, "Though I have a better idea." Margaret arched her eyebrows. "Curious. Why don't you all move to my place?" he proposed, the words coming out before he could polish them. "There's more than enough room, the yard is perfect for the girls to play, and you could have your own sewing studio. We're practically living together anyway, just in the wrong place." Silence followed his suggestion. The girls, sensing the adults had paused their conversation, stopped playing and looked over. "Are we going to live in Grandpa Rich's castle?" Ellie asked, eyes gleaming. "It's not exactly a castle, Ellie," Richard said gently. "But it's huge, and it has that princess staircase," she insisted. Margaret set aside her knitting, her expression a mix of emotions. "Richard, your house is beautiful, but it's yours, designed for you, your style. We'd be intruding." "That's not how I see it anymore," he said, moving to sit next to her. "That house was never really a home until you walked in. Remember what it was like before. Cold, impersonal. Now, with the Christmas tree, the girls' drawings on the fridge, the laughter, it came to life." Sophie approached, ever alert to adult conversations. "Could we bring our toys?" Richard smiled. "Of course, and you can pick any bedrooms you want. Even the big one with the window overlooking the garden," Sophie tested. "Especially that one," he confirmed. Margaret still hesitated. Richard gently took her hand. "Think about it. You wouldn't have to climb stairs every day, which is better for your heart. The girls would have space to play even on rainy days. It's closer to their school and—" He paused, choosing his words. "It would be our home. Not mine, not yours. Ours." There was a transparent sincerity in his eyes that made Margaret's heart flutter, not from her condition, but from a deeper, familiar emotion. "How would it work?" "Logistically," she asked, beginning to consider the possibility. "However you want," he replied readily. "We can renovate rooms, redecorate everything. Turn that cold house into the home you all deserve. And my flower shop, we'll keep it. And if you want to expand, we have space on the property for a greenhouse. I've always thought that garden was underused." Margaret's eyes lit up at the idea. Having her own greenhouse was an old dream she'd never realized. "Let's go, Grandma," Ellie pleaded, tugging on her sweater. "I want to live in the castle." Margaret glanced at the girls, at Richard, at the small apartment that had been her refuge for so many years. So many memories, Laura growing up, the girls taking their first steps. But maybe it was time to make new memories in a new place. "We can try," she said finally, "like a trial period." Richard's smile lit up his entire face. "It'll be perfect, I promise." And so the preparations began. Richard hired a team to adapt the mansion according to Margaret's wishes. Walls were repainted in warmer colors, old furniture was replaced with cozier pieces, and the master bedroom was fully renovated to accommodate Margaret's medical needs without resembling a hospital. For the girls, he transformed 2 adjacent suites into a magical space, with a connecting door between them. One side became Sophie's kingdom, featuring bookshelves and a desk for homework. The other side was Ellie's wonderland, colorful and spacious for play. One little detail especially delighted them. Richard installed an intercom system disguised inside plush toys so they could talk between rooms after bedtime. "Just don't abuse it," Margaret warned, though she smiled at the girls' excitement. In just 3 weeks, the move was nearly complete. Margaret's old apartment wasn't sold. Richard suggested keeping it, perhaps to turn it into her future sewing studio or a space for the girls when they grew older and needed independence. While organizing final details, an idea arose: celebrate their new beginning with a big Christmas dinner. After all, the holiday was coming, and it would be their first time officially celebrating as a family. "Can we invite people?" Margaret asked as they checked the moving to-do list. "Whoever you like," Richard replied. "I was thinking of some of my friends, neighbors who've always helped us, and maybe you'd like to invite some people from your work." Richard considered. "Janet, my assistant, and Charles, my partner, they've practically watched this whole transformation happen, even if they don't fully understand it. It'd be nice to show them why things changed so much." So the guest list grew naturally. Neighbors from Rose Garden Street who'd helped Margaret in tough times, a few flower shop employees, Mr. Jenkins who'd driven the girls to Richard's on that fateful snowy night, Sophie's teacher who'd been so understanding, and even Mrs. Peterson, the elderly flower shop customer who'd first spread rumors about Richard and Margaret. From Richard's side, in addition to Janet and Charles, they included his longtime housekeeper, the gardener who'd maintained the property for over a decade, and, in a last-minute decision, his older brother who lived in Europe and with whom he rarely spoke. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked when he mentioned his brother. "Though you hardly ever talk about him." "That's exactly why," Richard said. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Margaret. I've pushed people away, built walls. It's time to tear some of them down." The week leading up to Christmas was a flurry of activity. Margaret E., now fully moved into the mansion, oversaw the dinner preparations. Her heart, carefully monitored and medicated, allowed her to help in the kitchen as long as she respected her limits. Richard insisted she take regular breaks, leading to mild disagreements that always ended in fond smiles. "You're worse than my grandma," she joked, when he took a heavy pot from her hands. "Why, your grandma must have been a very wise woman," he teased back, kissing her forehead. Margaret taught Richard and the girls her family recipes, the special roasted pork her father used to make, the caramel pudding that had been a tradition since her childhood, the ginger cookies Laura loved decorating. Each dish had a story, a memory they now all shared. Meanwhile, Richard and the girls handled the decorations. The tree was already up, but they decided they needed more. Sophie suggested making paper stars to hang around the house. Ellie wanted drawings of reindeer and snowmen on the windows. Richard, who had never done such crafts, discovered he was surprisingly good at cutting out snowflakes. Janet, stopping by to deliver some documents, found her boss sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by colored paper and glue, with Ellie on his lap directing the operation. "Mr. Donovan?" she asked, astonished. Richard looked up with tape stuck in his hair and paint smudges on his fingers. "Oh, Janet, just leave the papers on the table, please. I'll sign them later. We're a bit busy right now, as you can see." Janet set the papers down mechanically, stunned by the scene. The man who once demanded documents be sorted by priority and tolerated no delays or disorganization now smiled, while a 3-year-old stuck lopsided stars to a shirt worth more than Janet's monthly salary. "I made this look." Ellie proudly displayed an unidentifiable collage of paper and glitter. "It's beautiful, Ellie," Janet replied automatically, still processing the transformation in her boss. "It's for our Christmas party," the little girl explained. "You're coming, right? Grandpa Rich said you're coming." Janet glanced at Richard, who nodded. "I hope you can make it, Janet. 7 o'clock on the 24th. Of course, sir. Thank you for the invitation." When she left, Margaret entered the living room, drying her hands on an apron. She surveyed the artistic chaos and smiled. "Janet looked shocked," Margaret remarked. Richard shrugged. "She'll get used to it. Eventually, they all will." On Christmas Eve, the mansion was unrecognizable. Wreaths adorned the doors, colored lights twinkled in every window, and the delicious aromas of the holiday meal filled every room. The formal dining table was extended to accommodate all the guests, covered with a red tablecloth Margaret had brought from her old apartment. The girls, dressed in new outfits their grandmother had sewn especially for the occasion, dashed excitedly around the house, checking the windows for the guests' arrival. Richard watched everything with a mix of nerves and joy. This was the first time he'd truly opened his house, not for business gatherings disguised as social events, nor for investor schmoozing, but for a genuine celebration with people who really mattered. "Everything okay?" Margaret asked, coming over to straighten his burgundy tie. "More than okay," he said, taking her hands. "I'm just taking it all in. How my life changed so quickly." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that still made his heart flutter. "For the better, I hope." No doubt about it. Charles was the first to arrive, punctual as ever, bearing an expensive bottle of wine and an expression of intense curiosity. He was closely followed by Janet and her husband, then some of Margaret's old neighbors. Soon the house was filled with chatter and laughter. Richard, who once felt uncomfortable in social settings outside of corporate events, found himself easily conversing with Margaret's friends. They were simple, genuine people without hidden agendas. Mr. Jenkins joked about how nervous he'd been leaving the girls at Richard's that snowy night. "I had no idea I was setting off a love story," he concluded, raising his glass in a toast. Richard felt his face heat up, Margaret laughing gently beside him. They hadn't labeled what they had, but it was undeniable that affection between them grew daily. Richard's brother arrived late, visibly uneasy and formal, but the girls quickly broke the ice by declaring they now had 2 grandpas. The man, who had no children, looked both shocked and secretly touched by the title. Dinner was served amid lively conversation. Margaret's homemade dishes received enthusiastic praise, especially from Charles, who confessed he'd never tasted such real home cooking. Richard watched the merging of his 2 worlds, corporate and family, with fascination. It was as if a lost part of himself had finally found its place. After the main course, as dessert was being prepared, Sophie led Ellie by the hand to a small open space by the Christmas tree. Margaret switched on a small electronic keyboard Richard hadn't known they owned, and the girls positioned themselves nervously. "Attention, please," announced Sophie, in her best attempt at a solemn 5-year-old voice. "Ellie and I prepared a Christmas surprise for everyone, especially for Grandpa Rich and Grandma." A fond hush fell over the room as Sophie played a few simple notes. Then both girls began to sing a Christmas carol in their childish voices, sometimes off-key, sometimes forgetting lines, but filled with genuine enthusiasm and emotion. Richard felt a lump in his throat. The little ones, dressed in matching outfits and bows, were singing directly to him and Margaret. No perfect rehearsal, a few wrong notes, moments when Ellie forgot the lyrics and made up funny words, but it was perfect. He glanced at Margaret, who was equally moved, her eyes shining with held-back tears. When he took her hand, he felt it tremble slightly. When the performance ended, the room erupted in applause. Ellie, thrilled by the reaction, took an exaggerated bow that nearly knocked her over, causing affectionate laughter. Sophie, more reserved, smiled proudly as she curtsied. Richard stood first, clapping enthusiastically. "Bravo, bravo," he exclaimed, not caring that everyone could see his emotions on full display. The girls ran to him, and he scooped them both up, spinning them in the air while they giggled. "You two are amazing. Did you know that?" he whispered, kissing each of their heads. With dessert finally served and everyone content, Richard stood up and lifted his glass. Gradually, the chatter subsided, and all eyes turned to him. Normally confident in corporate speeches, he now felt vulnerable. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. "Some of you have known me for years." His gaze met Charles's and Janet's. "Others are just meeting me." He smiled at Margaret's friends. "But all of you are part of what has become the greatest adventure of my life." He paused, searching for words. He hadn't prepared a speech, which was unusual for him. "For years I thought I had everything," he went on, voice slightly shaky. "Success, recognition, material things. I lived in a grand house that was never a home. I had everything money could buy, yet I lacked the essential." His eyes rested on Margaret. "Only now with you," he looked at her and at the girls, "do I understand what it really means to have a family." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. Sophie and Ellie, not fully grasping the depth of the moment but sensing its importance, hugged his legs. Surrounded by love and acceptance, Richard finally realized the greatest gift was simply being there with them. Spring arrived, bringing fresh colors to the mansion's garden. Richard stood by the office window, listening to Sophie and Ellie's laughter as they played outside. The month since Christmas had flown by, each day bringing new discoveries, small joys, occasional challenges, the rich tapestry of family life he now knew. Margaret had turned part of the garden into a floral haven. The promised greenhouse was nearly finished, and she already had plans to expand her flower shop business. Her health was stable, with strict medical checkups producing positive results. Richard closed his laptop, deciding to join them outside. Work could wait, a lesson that had taken him decades to learn, but which he now fully embraced. In the garden, he found Margaret pruning rose bushes, wearing a straw hat for shade. The girls ran around a small fountain, trying to catch butterflies. "Grandpa Rich!" Ellie shouted when she saw him, dashing over with her arms outstretched. He lifted her easily, twirling her around. Sophie came closer more calmly, but with the same bright excitement in her eyes. "Done with work for the day?" Margaret asked, smiling. "Yes. Some things are more important," he replied, sitting on a garden bench with Ellie still on his lap and Sophie next to him. Margaret joined them, carrying her gardening book. "I was thinking of planting more flowers over there," she said, pointing to a corner of the yard. "What do you think?" "I think you should do whatever you like with this garden," Richard said. "I trust your judgment more than mine." Sophie picked up the book Richard had brought, a light-hearted novel he never would have considered reading before. "Read a little to us." "Of course," he agreed, opening it where he'd left off. And there, with Margaret by his side, Sophie and Ellie listening intently, and the spring sun warming the garden now full of life, Richard finally understood. The true miracle of Christmas wasn't about gifts, decorations, or festivities. It was about rediscovering love, life, and the real meaning of having a home. He lowered the book for a moment, looking at the blue sky, the blooming flowers, and the three people who had transformed his existence. The life he'd built before felt distant now, like a strange, empty dream. "Everything okay?" Margaret asked, noticing his pause. Richard smiled, a complete, genuine smile that lit not just his face, but something deep within him. "Everything is perfect," he replied. "Absolutely perfect." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.